Nobody took a photograph. That is the thing that stays with you when you learn the full story of what happened that day. The most famous pop group in the history of the world. 4 people who had spent a decade in front of cameras and lights and the endless documentation of fame. And nobody thought to take a photograph. Or perhaps they did think about it. Perhaps they looked at each other across that room and understood that a photograph would mean admitting what none of them were ready to admit, that this was the last time. That was ABBA. And the day they were last in the same room together is a story that has never been fully told. To understand what that day meant, you have to understand what the years before it had taken from them. By 1982, the group that had conquered Eurovision, that had sold more records than almost any band in history, that had produced some of the most beloved songs of the 20th century, had quietly ceased to exist. Not with a press conference, not with a farewell tour, not with any of the ceremonies that the music industry typically uses to mark the end of something significant. Just silence. Björn and Agnetha's marriage had ended in 1979. They had kept working together, had stood next to each other in studios and on stages and in television studios, had sung together, had smiled for cameras, had given interviews in which they described their professional relationship as warm and functional and entirely workable. And it was. That was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about it. 2 people who had loved each other, who had built a family together, who had watched their marriage dissolve under the pressure of fame and touring and the relentless demands of being ABBA, had found a way to keep going. But keeping going has a cost, and by 1982, the cost had become too high. Benny and Anni-Frid's marriage had also ended, quietly, without drama, in the way that things end when both people involved have run out of the energy required to hold them together. They had tried, they had loved each other, but love, as ABBA's own songs had always known, is sometimes not enough. And so by the time that final day arrived, the 4 people in that room were not the same 4 people who had stood on the Eurovision stage in Brighton in 1974 and changed their lives forever. They were older. They were carrying things. They had learned, in the way that only experience teaches, that success and happiness are not the same thing. That you can have everything the world considers worth having, and still find yourself sitting in a room with 3 other people, wondering how it all came to this. But here is what nobody who was there has ever fully explained. What they actually said to each other, what the room felt like, whether there were tears, or whether the years of professional discipline had made tears impossible. Whether they knew, in that moment, that they would not all be in the same room again for a very long time. What we know is this: they met, they talked, and then, one by one, they left, and the door closed behind them. What happened in the hours and days that followed is the part of this story that changes everything you think you know about how ABBA ended. The weeks after that final meeting were strange. Not dramatic, not filled with the kind of visible pain that people expect when something significant ends. Just strange. The way a house feels after someone has moved out of it. The furniture is still there. The rooms are the same shape. But something essential is missing, and the absence of it changes everything. Agnetha went home to her house outside Stockholm, to her children, to the quiet life she had been quietly building in the spaces between ABBA's demands. She had always been the one who found the touring hardest, the one who had spoken most honestly, in interviews and in the years since, about the cost of what they had all given to the music. She loved the music. She had never pretended otherwise. But she had also always known that the music was taking something from her that she could not get back. Björn went to work. That was how he had always handled things, with productivity, with forward motion, with the particular discipline of someone who understands that the only way through something difficult is to keep moving. He had projects, he had ideas, he had the kind of mind that does not rest easily. and that finds in work a kind of relief that other people find in other things. Benny stayed close to the music. He always had. Of the four of them, Benny was perhaps the one most purely defined by what he did. The piano, the melodies, the endless capacity to find in a sequence of notes something that felt like truth. The end of ABBA did not end his relationship with music. Nothing could have done that. But it changed what the music meant, what it was for, who it was made with. And Anni-Frid did something that surprised almost everyone who knew her. She left. Not just Stockholm, not just Sweden. She left the life she had built, the country she had lived in for decades, the world that ABBA had created around all four of them. She moved to France, then to Switzerland. She reinvented herself with a thoroughness that spoke of someone who needed distance, not just from a place, but from a version of herself that she was no longer able to inhabit. There are people who grieve by staying, who sit with their losses and let them settle into the architecture of their daily lives. And there are people who grieve by moving, who understand that the only way to survive certain kinds of endings is to put physical distance between yourself and the place where it happened. Anni-Frid was the second kind. But here is what makes this part of the story more than just four people going their separate ways after a difficult decade. Because while they were all doing these very human things, while they were healing and working and moving and trying to build lives that did not have ABBA at the center of them, something was happening to the music they had left behind. Something that none of them had expected. Something that the music industry had no framework for understanding. Something that would eventually bring all four of them back to a question they thought they had already answered. The question of whether ABBA was really over. And the answer was not what anyone expected. Because somewhere in the world, at that very moment, a teenager who had never heard of ABBA was hearing Dancing Queen for the first time and falling in love with it. The way people had always fallen in love with it. Completely, without warning. Without any of the context that the people who made it had spent years trying to escape. Just the song, just the feeling, just the particular magic that Bjorn and Benny had put into those notes, and that Agnetha and Anni-Frid had given a voice that the world had never quite forgotten. The door had closed, but the music had slipped underneath it, and what happened next would take all four of them completely by surprise. The 1980s were not kind to ABBA's reputation. Not at first. The decade that followed their disappearance was one that valued certain things. Edge, irony, the performance of not caring. And ABBA had always been the opposite of those things. They had cared, openly, unashamedly. They had made music that reached for emotion directly, without apology, without the protective layer of cool that the 1980s demanded of its artists. For a few years, this worked against them. There was a period when ABBA was not something you admitted to liking, when the sequined costumes and the Eurovision origins and the unabashed melodic joy of their best work felt like relics of a more innocent time. A time that the harder-edged cultural moment of the early 1980s had no particular use for. But something was happening underneath that surface dismissal. Something quiet. Something that the critics and the tastemakers and the people who decide what is cool and what is not could not see. Because it was happening in living rooms, in cars, in the private spaces where people listen to music not to be seen listening to it, but because they need it. The songs kept playing. Not on the radio stations that chased trends, but in the places where music lives longest. Mothers played Dancing Queen for their daughters. Fathers played Fernando on long drives. The Winner Takes It All played at the ends of relationships, at the moments when people needed language for something they couldn't say themselves. A generation that had been children when ABBA was at its peak was growing up and carrying the music with them into adulthood. And then, in 1992, something happened that nobody in the music industry had predicted. A compilation album called ABBA Gold was released. It was not supposed to be a cultural event. It was supposed to be a straightforward commercial exercise, a collection of hits for a band that no longer existed, aimed at people who remembered them fondly. The kind of release that sells moderately, satisfies a small nostalgic audience, and disappears quietly after a few months. That is not what happened. ABBA Gold became one of the best-selling albums in the history of recorded music. It did not chart for weeks. It charted for years. It introduced ABBA to people who had never heard of them. It reminded people who had forgotten why they had loved them. It did something that almost no compilation album in history has ever done. It made the band more famous after they stopped existing than they had been when they were together. Bjorn heard the news from a distance. Benny heard it from his piano. Agnetha heard it in the quiet of her house outside Stockholm. And Anni-Frid heard it from somewhere in Europe, from the new life she had built in the deliberate distance from everything ABBA had meant. And each of them, separately, felt something shift. Not a decision, not yet. Just a question forming at the back of their minds. A question they had each been carefully not asking for more than a decade. A question about whether the door they had left slightly open, on that last day in that room in Stockholm, had ever really been meant to stay closed. The answer was coming. But it would take longer than any of them expected, and it would arrive in a form that none of them, not even Bjorn, not even Benny with all his musical imagination, could have predicted. Because the thing that would finally bring ABBA back together was not a record label. It was not a promoter. It was not money, though there would be plenty of that. It was something far stranger, far more human, far more like the music itself. It was a story that someone else had written about them, a story that had traveled around the world and found its way into the hearts of people who had never seen ABBA perform, and made them feel as though they had. And when the four of them finally heard what that story had become, everything changed. The story was called Mamma Mia. It had started as an idea in the mind of a British producer named Judy Kramer, who had spent years believing that ABBA's music contained something that a stage could hold. Not a tribute show, not a nostalgia act, something new, something that used the songs not as artifacts of a particular moment, but as the emotional architecture of a story that had never been told before. It had taken her years to convince anyone. The music industry is not a place that rewards the unconventional proposal. And the idea of taking songs written by two Swedish men about their own marriages and divorces, and building around them an entirely new story about a young woman searching for her father, was unconventional in ways that most people could not see past. But Bjorn and Benny said yes. They listened to what Judy Kramer had in mind, and they said yes. Perhaps because they recognized something in what she was describing. Perhaps because the songs she wanted to use were songs they had written at the most honest moments of their lives. And there was something right about those songs being given a new context, a new reason to exist. Mamma Mia opened in London's West End in 1999, 17 years after ABBA had last been in the same room together. The reviews were not uniformly kind. Some critics found it too joyful, too unguarded, too willing to embrace the very qualities that had always made ABBA an easy target for a certain kind of cultural dismissal. But the audiences were something else entirely. They came in their thousands. They sang along. They laughed and they cried, and they left the theater humming songs that some of them had not heard in 20 years, and found that the songs had lost nothing, that the melodies were exactly where they had left them, that Bjorn's words and Benny's music had survived the decade of cool dismissal completely intact, waiting patiently for the world to remember what it had always known. Agnetha saw it. She sat in that theater and watched strangers fall in love with songs that had cost her everything, and felt something that she has described, carefully, as complicated. Pride, grief, something that was both at once. The songs were hers. They were also no longer hers. They belonged to everyone now. They always had. Anni-Frid saw it from a different country, from the life she had built at a careful distance from all of it. She has spoken about that period with a kind of measured grace, the way she speaks about most things that matter deeply. She was glad the music was alive. She was glad the world had not forgotten. But she was also still, in some ways that she has never fully articulated, standing in that studio in Stockholm, still carrying what that decade had cost. And then came 2021, 40 years after the visitors, 39 years after that last day in that room. Benny called Bjorn, or Bjorn called Benny. The accounts vary. But the conversation was the same. What if they tried again? Not a tour, not a live performance, something new, something that only technology made possible, something that would let them be ABBA again, without requiring them to be the people they had been in 1974. The avatars, digital versions of themselves as they had looked at the height of their fame, performing the new songs they had written, in an arena built specifically for the purpose, for audiences who had waited, in some cases, their entire lives. Voyage was released in November 2021. It went to #1 in multiple countries. The arena shows sold out in minutes. A new generation discovered ABBA for the first time. An older generation rediscovered what they had never really lost. And somewhere in all of that, something happened that is almost impossible to describe, without it sounding like something from one of the songs themselves. The four of them were in the same room again. Not on a stage, not in front of cameras. Just four people who had been through everything together, who had built something extraordinary and watched it end, and lived the long, complicated years that followed, sitting together in a room in Stockholm. Nobody has reported exactly what was said. Nobody took notes. Nobody, as far as anyone knows, took a photograph. But those who were nearby have said that the room felt different, that something had been completed, that the silence between them, the long silence that had stretched across 4 decades, had finally said everything it needed to say. ABBA never announced they were done. They just stopped. And then, one day, without announcement, without ceremony, they simply started again. Because some things are too large to end. Some music is too true to disappear. And some stories, no matter how many times the door closes behind them, always find a way back in.